Okay, gang, hello there. There's one more video that we need on the website before this session is concluded, and it's one that I actually need to create. So I'm going to do that today. And this is for the reading by Damon Pfister and Misty Yang that I'm teaching for the first time in this class, although I taught it, I think, one other time in another class a year or two ago in my public sphere class. And I was trying to find something on digital technology and rhetoric, and there's a couple of other pieces that I've worked with, but I want to try getting back to this one. I think it's actually a really good essay that thinks broadly about, kind of where we're at today, thinking about the rapid pace of technological change and how that's affecting sort of how we live, not just individually, but more about sort of our collective relations and so on. So I'll just work through this. I also posted these reading notes that are meant to help streamline the reading for you. The whole essay is structured around these 5 theses, right? So that already is sort of, you're getting some nice coherent structure there. But we'll just talk about the opening kind of setup and the basic idea of their argument, and then we can sort of hit some of the little pieces along the way there. And I'll try to do this in about 15 to 20 minutes. All right. So obviously rhetoric is an ancient art of social engagement. It's an ancient practice. It's been theorized, as we know now, since, the sophists, Plato, Aristotle, and all the rest. Pretty sure they didn't have cell phones back there, right? So this is a very analog, organic, humans in their skin, engaging one another using originally words, arguments, right? Speeches. Oratory is the original kind of technology of rhetoric. Obviously, today we are in a very different world. And, when I very first started teaching and getting serious about this area of study, I'm trying to think now. In fact, it was when I was an undergraduate back in the University of Lethbridge in Canada. This was like late 90s. Email just came out. I remember I had one professor. She's the one who got me excited about rhetoric, Jennifer McLennan. And she had this little orange computer screen behind her. And every once in a while it would beep during our meetings, and she'd go, "Yay, I got another piece of mail." And she's like, "You should try email." I was like, "What are you talking about? What are you going on about with this email business? I don't know what you mean." That was like my first introduction to email. And then it all came tumbling out, the internet, the web, and search browsers, and then of course came phones and personal devices, and then the smartphones, and then smart technology is becoming more and more ubiquitous, and it's becoming more and more personal. In fact, Damon Pfister is working on a book right now on wearable technology. So it's all about how this stuff has become so much more attached to individuals. It's more about our bodies and the individual consumer / citizen, and that's why we want to be thinking about the implications here. So and things are just moving faster and faster all the time. And so rhetorical scholars, I remember when the internet stuff was first kicking in, there was a lot of it's a fad. We don't need to worry about this. It's just more kind of trendy social stuff that'll come and go. Maybe a few scholars kind of played around with electronic communication a little bit. But sure enough, it didn't come and go, and it got more and more expansive, and it became more and more a part of our personal lives, our work lives, our social lives, and increasingly now our political lives and public lives. So rhetorical scholars are sort of increasingly having to grapple with digital technology and all of its related uses, practices, new norms, ways of talking about, and so on and so on. Even my own work, which has been steeped in food and taste and ecology stuff now for a good decade or so, I have become increasingly kind of pushed in this direction. I feel I'm being pushed just because in order to kind of research anything, like for me, researching food and taste, you don't get too deep into the literature before you start kind of running up against production and technology in the production of food and in the distribution of food and in the engineering of food and the designing of food and the designing of food spaces, like Greg Dickinson's essay, and so much of kind of just our everyday lives and our everyday experiences are sort of touched by technology, and especially digital technology and smart technology. So we need to start taking this stuff pretty seriously, and I think Damon Pfister is one of the best voices in rhetoric on really taking serious this technology and knowing sort of how it's operating and what the promises and assurances are, and then what it's actually doing. And thinking about that still in connection back to the kind of rhetoric's roots in the ancient world, and Pfister's really great at that. Misty Yang is actually one of my own. I was on her thesis committee. She was a graduate student in our department. I actually recruited her when I was a grad coordinator into our program. So I'm happy to say that Misty Yang is one of UNLV's products as a grad student. She went on and she is now currently working with Damon Pfister out at University of Maryland, getting her PhD. She's kind of wrapping up, and they're doing great work together. So happy to be teaching this. I'm big fans of both of theirs. So let's just hit it, shall we? The core kind of idea here is that rhetoric, democracy, going back to the ancients, right? Democracy and publicness are important kind of co-constituents, right? Democracy requires publicness. Publicness must be democratic in order to be fully itself, right? So the public sphere is this important concept. I teach an entire class on the public sphere. The whole idea being that like citizens come together in this public space, wherever it might be, and they come together because of their concerns over, common matters, common issues, whatever they might be, right? It's this coming together of people who have no other reason to come together, no work-related reason or cultural or family related or anything. It's the only reason they're coming together discursively is because of their shared concerns over common matters, right? And they deliberate and they persuade and they engage and they harass and badger each other and they try to win over the kind of the court of public opinion, right? Because what flows out of that is policy, decisions, action, and change in the new future. All right, so the public is a pretty important and precious concept for both rhetoric and democracy. I see the public here, and I see both rhetoric and democracy kind of hooking into the public. They both need it, and therefore they all kind of work together really nicely, right? So that's the concern here. This idea of a networked public sphere is new, and Pfister and Yang are trying to proceed with some caution here. So they start off by talking about these Apple town squares. They're the Apple stores, but they like to call themselves town squares because it sounds civic, right? This sounds like it's more important than just shopping. You're coming to a town square. We think of these old, New England town squares, right? Like the plazas. Let's come together. Let's give speeches. Let's protest. Let's march. Let's debate one another. Let's even harass one another. But we're doing it sort of out in the public, and we're trying to get our opinions out there, and we're trying to change opinions. And so Apple is the language. They say they absorb the language. Apple as a commercial enterprise, right? This is a capitalistic organization. They're using the language of politics, essentially, of civic life, right? It's this idea of a town square. It's let's just borrow this language and call what we do in our Apple stores a town square. And we can even pretend like we're being educational, pedagogy, right? What do you do when you come to the town square? Well, you get educated, just like in liberal democracy. You come in and you share opinions, right? So Pfister and Yang are a little troubled by this example because, of course, Apple stores are places of commerce. They're private. There's a whole different set of legal constraints and regulations that protect commercial spaces that don't protect public spaces in the same way, right? So there's a very real kind of limitation to the borrowed metaphor by Apple of calling their stores town squares. They're not, in fact, town squares because, as Pfister and Yang know, you couldn't imagine a protest happening. You couldn't imagine people coming into this town square and like having a sit-in over the let's say the factory conditions in China where these phones were made in the first place. Can you imagine consumers coming in and saying, I'm not buying a phone until you raise the wages of the workers, the kid workers in China, right? It's like you're going to get kicked out immediately, right? So that's why these are kind of fictional public spaces. They're not. They're commercial spaces. They're private spaces of transaction and market exchange, which is fine. You know, we like markets, we certainly like our Apple products, but it's that blurring of the lines between the private and the public, and the fact that a commercial market-driven enterprise is attempting to kind of co-opt the language of the civic and citizenship and education and pedagogy. This is what they're struggling with. I like this in 248 in the bottom left in that column there. They're looking at some of the examples that Apple's giving of like the kinds of educational experiences you can have when you come to the town square, and it's like Teacher Tuesdays for school instructors to learn new ways of incorporating technology into their classrooms. Woo! By the way, when I have to submit my annual report as a scholar, as a professor every year, they always ask this question of like, how do you use technology innovatively in the classroom? It's always been on these annual reviews. It's like, as a professor, you get like little bonus goodie points if you are innovative with technology. It's like baked into our very assumptions about what constitutes any kind of progress, right? It's like you must use technology. I remember Tom Conley, who I learned rhetoric from. He's that, you know, old ancient scholar of rhetoric, and he used to like to pull out his pen and say, "This is my word processor." You know? I'm not that bad, but I do proceed with these new fancy devices with some caution, just because I haven't seen a lot of improvement. I've seen more convenience, but not necessarily improvement, right, in terms of collective life. In any case, they continue here. What do we got else? Opportunities for business people to engage. What do we got? Business circuit programs, specialized kids hours, woo! And lessons on community organizing from local radicals. And they say, as if, right? It's like as if you're going to learn how to be political at an Apple store. So they're calling foul, they're calling BS on this whole kind of new rhetoric of what they call it technoliberalism. They also use the phrase tech evangelism, right? This idea that like you watch TED Talks, you watch these these annual Apple addresses, or these big kind of, or even in here in Vegas, the CES convention, right? The rhetoric of that convention. I actually did a project one time where I went to that CES convention to look at all the rhetoric, the promises, and like what's coming, and what are the new values that are being pushed out. It's pretty wild stuff. So they're saying tech evangelism. The way that we talk about tech, it's very evangelical. It's like, this is going to save us. It's going to save us as individuals, and it's going to save us as a society. And they want to be very cautious and careful about the realities behind these promises, right? Now, they start off by talking in the early pages of this thing of the trivium. And it's pretty worth noting. Did we talk about this early on? I can't remember. Anyway, in the ancient context, the trivium was rhetoric, dialectic, and grammar, or rhetoric, philosophy, and what we might call English, or grammar, right? And it's like sort of the mechanics of expression. Rhetoric is more about persuasion and oratorical speaking and argumentation and these kinds of things. Dialectic, as we know, is about big questions, big philosophical questions, process of inquiry, of exchange, back and forth, and so on. All right, but in the ancient context, these three pursuits were the absolute foundation of what we now know as the liberal education. To be philosophically trained to ask big, hard questions, to be compositionally trained to express oneself and to understand literacy and composition. And then with rhetoric, it's about relating to others and being sort of orally literate and being sort of versed in argumentation and persuasion, right? If you could do all those things together, you are a liberal citizen. And what flows out of the liberal citizen is good ideas, good arguments, right? The ability to defend and challenge, and what flows out of that, ideally, is a strengthened sense of the public and a grounded democracy and strong ideas and integrity and these kinds of things. So that's like going back to the beginning. The trivium is sort of the kernel of rhetoric, the kernel of liberal education, which itself was the kernel of democracy, right? And so Pfister and Yang are seeing that setup being like basically dismantled by this new thing they call technoliberalism. 15 minutes, I better speed up. All right, so technoliberalism then is their term for this kind of new regime that we occupy. And it's a regime of activity, it's a regime of talk, it's a regime of valuation, right? It describes this kind of new world where digital technology, these devices that we wear, that we carry around with us, our laptops, our phones, our watches, now increasingly it's coming into our homes as well. It's our, Alexas and our surveillance cameras and all this other stuff that's just kind of like popping up all around us, right? This is technoliberalism. The idea being that the more we participate in these smart devices, the more our lives will be improved, right? Not just in terms of convenience, but in terms of better results for whatever it is we're doing, less waste, less inefficiency, right? So these are meant to improve our lives in our homes, on the street, in our workplaces. I mean, my goodness, think about this COVID business and how much we've been relying on virtual, digital technologies to keep any semblance of like normal life proceeding, right? So they're certainly become very necessary and important and useful. The question, I guess, still is like, to what extent are they doing the kind of the important civic work of, pre-digital times in terms of just us getting educated and then going out and kind of like engaging with one another? That's the question. So from there, I think that's most of that preliminary stuff. The tensions between the public citizen and the marketplace consumer, the ancient trivium, rhetoric and deliberative publicness. I'm just reading my my study guide here. Democracy, this business of a public good. Right, so they asked this question eventually, like, what is a public good? They're drawing on Rob Ason's work here for this idea of neoliberalism and how it impacts the public, right? So behind techno-neoliberalism is this other concept of neoliberalism, right? This is one that, we don't want to get too deep into, but basically the idea that all of life should be orchestrated in terms of free market relations, right? So because the market is such a powerful and important thing in our lives, we should just marketize everything. Marketize education, marketize national parks, marketize the military, marketize or monetize or commodify or privatize, right? Whatever is not already part of the marketplace, let's get it in there, right? So that's more or less the kind of the governing rationality or the governing logic of our society over the last 3-4 decades, really. This really picked up steam after the Second World War. So privatize, deregulate, get the government out of our business, turn more and more things over to the private market, reduce tariffs and taxes, and just basically get the government out of the free market and let the free market have as much as it wants, right? And sort of the digital tech stuff is flying into that space of the free marketplace with all of these shiny new toys. And of course, the consumers are eating them up because they're fun and they're powerful and they let us do all these interesting things. And they give them to us for free. So why wouldn't we want these things? Well, of course, what do they say? There's no free lunches in nature. It's like, if it's free, you got to ask yourself, what's the product, right? It's us. All right, so that leads into kind of their theses, their 5 theses. And they're just kind of coming at this core idea from 5 different angles, really. The dominant governing rationality, right? So what digital technologies do is they intensify already existing market relations or market logics of extraction and growth. You might have heard this phrase that data is the new oil. I don't know if you've come across that line, but oil companies and energy companies have for quite some time been the most dominant, powerful, wealthy institutions on the planet because cars and factories and, the industrial economy was really built on energy, and it still largely is. But now things are shifting. Instead of the oil companies, it's the data companies, the tech firms that are the wealthiest corporations on earth, right? And it's data, our data, what we do, what we engage with, how it is that we're spending our time, our thoughts, our words, our engagements, our friendships, where we shop, what we watch, all that stuff, all that private information, that's the new oil. And it's extremely valuable, right? So in fact, these companies should be paying us to have phones. We shouldn't pay for phones. We're giving over so much of our data. They should be paying us. My wife, this is the way they do it, by the way. My wife is in charge of our insurance, paying our insurance each month, so she takes care of car insurance and all that. And State Farm came to her a few months back and said, hey, if you put these little chips in your car and download this app and let us follow you when you're driving, we'll give you a 5% discount on your insurance. And so she wants 5% discount, so she kind of strong-armed me to put this thing in my car against my protest, because I hate the idea of being tracked everywhere I go. But I wanted her to, have her 5% savings, so I did it. I finally yanked it out of my vehicle just like a week or two ago. I'm just like, I'm so done with this. Because I've been researching this stuff more and more, and the amount of tracking, the amount of location following, the amount of surveillance, the amount of your private information that's just getting hoovered up into these databases and then swapped around to the highest bidder, it's concerning, right? So 5% discount is pittance. It's nothing compared to how valuable this data is to them. So they should be paying us. So technoliberalism is like digital technologies are kind of coming into the marketplace, and they are doing the work of these corporations. They're finding the data, they're finding the goods within us, within our brains, within our daily lives, and our little private personal spheres, what we do, all that activity. We ought to be somewhat concerned about this, right? Because so much of what we would consider to be private, important, our health data. I mean, they can track minor fluctuations in your mood based on all kinds of different variables, right? It's pretty spooky, the level of granular detail these tech firms have over us. So let's see here. The public good stuff kicks in on 250. I like this right in the dead center on the left in 250 in the left column. Robert Asen writes, a sense of the public good. This is what they feel is being kind of lost or challenged or actively attacked by digital tech. Let's see. Constitutes a practice of articulating mutual standing and connection. This is what we ideally should want for a healthy democracy. Mutual standing and connection, recognizing that people can solve problems and achieve goals and struggle for justice through coordinated action, right? This is really the kind of the bread and butter of rhetorical studies, for the most part, for its entire existence. Now I think rhetorical scholars are starting to wonder, is there anything left for us to even talk about in terms of a meaningful sense of what rhetoric actually is anymore? Because we're losing completely any sense of kind of public, deliberate engagement, and it's pretty clear that democracy is something that people don't want to fight too hard for. It's much more easy to just kind of get on our devices and make stuff happen instantaneously, right? So this idea of the public good is really important both for democracy and for rhetoric. And so we need to be thinking about to what extent it's still there, even if the promises of it being there are out there. Is the actual public and that public good, these values of connection and mutual standing and shared goals and cooperative deliberative action, is that happening? Can it happen? These are important questions. Tech evangelism is on the next column. That's good. Next thesis, replaces public democratically accountable power, expertise of digital technology firms. Yes. So these tech firms, they on the bottom right of 251, they refer to these tech firms as a kind of neo-feudalism, they say. The ascendant corporate control of public life risks a kind of neo-feudalism, where contracts with digital firms replicate the relationship between vassal and noble. Again, most of the apps that we have on our phone, most of the stuff that we use is given to us for free. But we enter into a contract, whether or not we know it, because more and more of this stuff is happening kind of invisibly below the scenes. You used to have to approve an update of any app on your phone. Remember this? I don't know if you even do, but like it used to be the case where it's like, hey, Facebook wants to update itself. Will you allow it, right? And everyone's just like, yeah, of course. Update. And now finally it's just moved into behind the scenes. All this stuff's just happening, right? Our consent is just being sort of more or less assumed. When you do a new upgrade, you consent. All these like terms and conditions that we just sort of automatically agree to. They've managed to sneak a lot of stuff in there over the course of a decade plus, and most of it has to do with them grabbing our private data and selling it to other vendors, right? Those vendors are now going to create products and services and messages that are coming straight for your brain, right? So this is sort of how this digital ecosystem is shaping. And maybe you're cool with that because you get to have fun toys in your hands and you get to do powerful, cool things with these apps and these images. But underneath is a lot of just old school capitalistic, like, monopolistic or close to monopolistic practices. The heads of these firms were in front of Congress a week ago testifying for their lives, essentially, in an antitrust committee hearing, right? It's like antitrust is, are you operating against the nation, essentially? Are you operating at such a level of monopoly that we should be concerned about the competition in the marketplace, and we should be concerned about the purchase power of the individual consumer, right? This is becoming really high level concern here. And it's because, these Facebook, Google, Apple, Amazon, these are the biggies, right? And they operated in a space, and still largely do, that was basically like the frontier, right? The 19th century frontier, where it's just like, it's the Wild West. Just go for it. There's very little regulation. So a lot of this stuff's been happening very quickly and very invisibly, and these scholars are trying to reckon with this in terms of like how it cycles back to the way that we live our lives, publicly, democratically, and as hopefully concerned citizens who see the value in coming together as as generic, right? When we come together in public, we still see, with the Black Lives Matter movements and Me Too, we see protests. We certainly do. But these are also protests that are largely about the kind of the already agreed upon, right? And so where is the space of like disagreement? Where is the space of interaction? Increasingly, the digital stuff is, we see what we already believe. We see what those people who are delivering up the news and the information know that we already want to see, because attention is where the money is, right? Our attention is what most of these business models are built upon. Facebook gets ad dollars because their product is reaching directly to the consumers where it needs to reach, right? That's the beauty of the data, is you can find the exact individuals you're looking for. So it's efficient, right? And so being able to grab the attention of the potential consumer, buyer, user, whatever, is the game here. And you can pay a lot of money to get that access to my brain. So that's new power, N-O-O power, brain. So it's power over subjectivity. It's a power over our thoughts, what's coming in, the news feeds, the bubbles, the massaged and non-fact checked, and the messages that are sent out to the very viewers that are going to agree with them the most, right? So we have some very major concerns about the quality of the discourse that's flying around on these networks, because most of it is just finding the recipients where the Velcro will be the stickiest, right? And that's happened increasingly in the life. We're talking about roughly a decade here, and it's happened increasingly. So this is Algorithmic Governmentality. 252, bottom right, starts that last paragraph. Algorithms, of course, are the codes that drive all of these processes and these platforms and services and these devices. They're the, sort of the computer software coding mechanisms that make things do what they do, right? So, and they're citing this as a form of governmentality. And so this is a kind of new regime of governance, this whole world of digital smart tech, because it's giving us all of this free, fun stuff, but it's taking so much of our data, so much of our personal private information, our health information, our online surfing habits and purchasing habits and things that we might say, even to a friend in a text message or a Facebook Messenger message. All of that stuff's up for grabs, right? So just think about like what you're actually giving up when you get things for free. I remember maybe a year or so ago, there was this new software program where you could take a picture of yourself and there's all kinds of like changed facial features, right? This is like AI facial recognition software laboratory that they're just like throwing out on the public. Here, help us beta test our new app, our new program or whatever. We just do it for free. It's crazy. All right, so be more concerned than you are, please. Algorithms, yeah. Gosh, there's so much more good stuff in here, but we're already at, 30 minutes. All right, so I'll actually wrap up there. The key ideas have been hit: algorithmic governmentality, new power, grammatized subjects. A grammatized subject, that's us. New power is power over thoughts, right? So when a subject has been grammatized, they've become essentially a product or an object or a commodity. This new digital stuff has managed to kind of turn us into data banks, resources, and so we're so enmeshed in these platforms that we have become grammatized. So there's a lot in here. It's, if you have some concerns about technology and democracy, this is a great piece to kind of like get at all that. And it raises really great questions about the relations, between rhetoric, sort of thinking about it in the broadest context, and this wild new frontier of technology and smart tech and personal tech and this and that, right? So I'll shut up there, and that'll be plenty in terms of what you need to know for the test. And that's it. So I will finish loading up everything I need to, and you'll have everything for the test and to finish up this session strong, and I hope you do. So cheers, gang.